So recently, I've been focusing on sculpting character bases from scratch instead of relying on pre-made ones. And during these months of unparalleled focus and determination, I've managed to craft a grand total of 1.5 models. So I think that's enough practice for now, and I want to turn my attention elsewhere. Now, my projects so far have been either completely static or only capable of a limited amount of movement. So my aim of this project was to experiment with creating a character with a much greater range of motion. And due to the increases in complexity, I decided to model a basic concept. And this concept was made by this person, so check out their work and stuff. Now, after picking this concept, the one issue I had with it was that it was simple. Too simple. I mean, would it really be a proper project if I didn't unnecessarily stress over it? So I decided to challenge myself and to try to complete the modeling part within a single day. So, after waking up bright and early at the prime time of 2 p.m., I made myself a coffee and set off to work. So to start with, as usual, I went to Sketchfab to find some reference, and I ended up finding a model that looked very similar to the concept. Now, as tempting as it was to just slap on some colors and call it a day, I figured that would be too lazy. So instead, I decided to do the more honorable thing, and to only steal the body. Now, unfortunately, the character had been mildly dissected, so it was up to me to put them back together. Now, to do this, I filled the holes, I bridged together separated geometry, I added primitive shapes to replace missing body parts, and finally, I remeshed them all together. I then chopped it in half. This video is definitely getting me put on some kind of list. Anyway, I mirrored the remaining side and remeshed again to keep the model manifold. So with the body done, it was time to model clothes. For the jacket and collars, I used some subdivided planes. For the sleeves, I used a subdivided cube. For the shoes, I duplicated the feet and scaled them up. And lastly, for the skirt, I used a subdivided cylinder that I extruded downwards, and then after shaping it a bit, I adjust the crease property on the edges to get a more sharper dip into the creases. I then added some colors, a simple bow, and with that, the first pass was pretty much done. So with that done, it was time to start modeling the head. To start off with, I did the hair, and as usual, I used a curve with a bevel method. Now, this method would actually cause issues down the line, but I'll get into that later. So after doing the first pass of the hair, I moved on to the face. I added a mouth and nose using planes, added some eyelashes and eye folds using some edges with a skin modifier, and then I removed the eye holes, since I wanted to try a different approach when it came to doing the different expressions. But once again, we'll get into that later. Now, with the face set in place, I went back to fix the hair. I puffed it up a bit more and added some ponytails. Now, I didn't bother connecting the ponytails to the head, since I was skeptical to whether or not this was going to be necessary. So I just left the hair floating in a state of limbo, and honestly, it worked out pretty well. So with the body and head done, it was time to start adding some line art. But first, I needed to retopologize the body. Now, I hate retopology, but fortunately, I have software that mostly automates this step. It's still really bloody annoying, but since I'm planning to heavily deform the mesh, I don't have much of a choice. So after retopologizing the mesh, it was time to add some line art. To do this, I added an inverse hull to everything, and as expected, there was a lot of clipping. So I spent some time fixing that up. Now, with the modeling stage being mostly done, I was comfortable to start doing the UV unwrapping. So after unwrapping the character, I began texture painting. I started reapplying all the colors and adding slight shading here and there. Now, for the dress and the hat, I wasn't about to go and try perfectly paint lines and diamonds. So to do this, I used some primitive shapes to create a tileable pattern. I then used an orthographic camera to render the pattern as an image. I then imported that image, applied camera coordinates to it, and then finally slapped it onto the object. Now, while this worked for the dress, the hat was still having issues. The problem with the hat was it didn't matter how much I fiddled with the mesh, I couldn't get the line art to show consistently. In order to fix this, I decided to paint the bottom of the hat the same color as the line art. To do this, I painted a mask, which I used to switch between the tiled pattern and the solid line color, and it worked out pretty well. So with the painting pretty much done, I just finished up the line art by adding some lines to the dress and the shoes using the same method as I used for the eyes. Now, at this point, I had been modeling for like 8 hours, and I was getting very tired. But I was so close to my goal, and even though I had an early start in the morning, I still wanted to continue. I was feeling motivated, and I was determined to see this through. Now, you might be thinking, whatever, just turn your computer back on. But the thing is, my computer is what you would call a piece of shit. So due to it being like a decade old, not having a solid state drive, and also having software on startup like Docker and Discord, etc., it takes around half an hour for it to turn back on. So as I was waiting for my computer to turn back on, I ended up convincing myself that sleep is more of a requirement than a suggestion, and I decided to go to bed. So a couple of days later, it was time to start on the hair. But at this point, the subtle complexities of the concept started to reveal itself. Now, when looking at the line art, you have the typical dark lines that differentiate the major forms, but the concept also had lighter lines within these volumes to further accentuate the separation. And this was sort of a pain, since, for example, with the hair, I wasn't sure how to manipulate the line art within the hair volume to make it a green color, while at the same time having the line art outside the hair volume use the standard brown color. Now, there might be a way to do this via the shader editor, but if there is, I don't know how to do it. So I took the less sophisticated approach of just merging all the shit together. Now, this wasn't ideal since it meant I had to convert the curves to a mesh, so I could no longer easily make adjustments to the hair. But to get the look I was going for, it was a necessary sacrifice. So with the hair done, I made a background, and the modeling phase of the project was finally done. Overall, it took me around 10.5 hours to model the character, which I'm pretty happy with. I still made a mistake here or there that lost me some time, but overall, 10 hours ain't bad. Now, time for a quick tangent. So, after finishing that milestone, I did what I normally do, and I posted it to Twitter and Reddit. Not too long later, I got a message from someone explaining that the reference I had posted didn't link back to the original artist, which I admit, that's my bad. And they also mentioned that I probably should ask permission to use that art. Now, good on that person for contacting me. And if you guys see me doing something you don't agree with, let me know. I'm not perfect and I make mistakes. But I'm not the most social person, and I don't have a lot of experience talking or interacting with other artists. So the need to ask for permission wasn't something I'd ever thought about before. And after reflecting on this, I realized I don't really agree with that sentiment. Perhaps it's because I spent too much time on YouTube, but my view on using copyrighted material is heavily influenced by the concept of fair use. And to me, the approval of the copyright holder isn't the sole determinant of whether or not I can use the copyrighted material. And in this case, considering the educational aspect, the transformative nature of 2D to 3D, and how the fan art of the concept isn't really stepping on the toes of the original artist at all, I would consider this to be fair use. That being said though, fair use is a sort of complicated area that's influenced by a lot of factors. And just because I believe my use case to be fair doesn't necessarily mean it is. And it's also important to point out that on a communal level, people are going to have different beliefs on copyright, and you need to be respectful to a certain degree of that. And in this instance, I couldn't really think of a good reason why I couldn't just give them the courtesy of asking for permission. So I took down the post I made and I asked the original artist for permission to use that work. Now, the original artist was very nice and understanding, and despite me technically already violating their wishes, they still allowed me to use their work, which was very awesome of them. But why am I telling you guys this? Well, because these videos are meant as a way for me to reflect on my art projects, and I feel like this is an important part of it. Either way, from now on, I'll start using direct sources instead of linking to Pinterest. It'll be interesting to see how I feel about this situation in a year or so from now. Okay, tangent over. Anyway, back to the actual 3D project. Now that I had finished the modeling, it was time for me to move on to more unfamiliar territory of posing the character. So to pose the character, the first thing I needed to do was to give it a rig. Now, since this character is simple and stylized, I chose to use the basic meta rig instead of the standard one, since I didn't want to have to delete the facial bones and have a bunch of potential errors caused by it. Now, this turned out to be a mistake since the basic meta rig doesn't have fingers, and it wasn't until I had already set up the skeleton that I realized this. But I still didn't want to use the standard meta rig for the fingers, so to deal with this, I made a separate armature for the fingers and then parented it to the IK hands. So with the rig set up, I generated the control rig and auto-weight painted my character to it. But it was at this point I wanted to test something a little unconventional. Now, normally the next step would be to clean up the weight painting and to add extra bones for things such as the skirt or jacket. But the problem I have with this approach is that it takes a lot of time to do this, and more importantly, it's really fucking boring. So I didn't want to do it. So the thing I wanted to test is, instead of going through that pain in the ass, how long would it take me to just sculpt the character into the correct pose? So with this in mind, I skipped the weight painting phase and I went straight into posing the character. Now, posing the character didn't take that long. And after that was done, it was time to fix the mesh. To do this, I created a shape key for each pose. Now, as you might imagine, some of the poses were a lot easier to fix than others, and most of the time spent was trying to fix up the skirt. Initially, it was pretty easy to make adjustments, but as I progressed, I started to struggle with a few things. The first major hurdle I ran into was trying to control the curvature at the end of the skirt. Sometimes I wanted the end of the skirt to flow outwards, and sometimes I wanted it to flow inwards, and it was sort of hard to do this with the sculpt brush. The next issue I ran into was trying to keep the round shape on the end of the dress. Trying to select the correct points was a pain, especially when the solidify modifier was applied. I found myself constantly selecting the wrong points, with me needing to regularly turn off the line art just to be able to actually get the correct shape. Now, these issues didn't cause me a huge amount of grief, but they did slow me down a lot. Now, with the poses done, it was time to give the character some expression. Now, as I said before, I wanted to do this a little differently. Instead of having the expression be part of the face geometry, I wanted to keep it completely separate. The reason I wanted to test this is because I just don't think trying to geometrically fit the face to the mesh is worth the effort. The expression of anime characters can vary so much, and trying to come up with a 3D representation that can easily morph and create a wide range of expressions just seems unnecessarily complicated. While important for certain media, if all I'm concerned about is the camera view, then I'd much rather just draw the face using grease pencil. What also swayed me to this opinion is the line art. Even with the precise sculpting of the poses, there was still so much clipping that was left in the model. And if I just used grease pencil for the line art, this problem would mostly be avoided. Now, since I've already done the line art using the inverse hole method, I'll have to test that out another day. So for the final render, I decided to model the expressions in a very flat way, just to see if it would look fine. And then after that seemed like that was okay, I then finally painted over some of the errors using grease pencil. And then as a final step, I rendered out the poses, placed them into a new scene, added them to some planes, and then animated those planes to transition between each image. And with that, this is the final output. So yeah, the posing stage took me around 10 hours or so. So not very fast. In fact, quite slow really. But I feel like this workflow still has potential, and I just need to find the right balance between sculpting the poses and weight painting them. Overall, I'm very happy with how this project turned out. Even though the project technically was very simple, I still felt like I got a lot out of it. Well, that's the video. Till next time.